It's great to see everyone today. The question today, for those of you just joining, the question for today is, do you think this summer is going to be similar to 2019 or harder than 2019 or about the same? And the reason we're asking that in the way we are and not in a poll is we're curious about probably more than just a yes or no or a harder same, but where are you thinking, how are you thinking this summer's for you relating to 2019, which was our last pre-pandemic summer? And how I'm defining harder is subjective. So by harder, I mean that your staffing may be more challenging. I mean that you may be seeing more animals, and please feel free to be specific. We're sort of trying to figure out what to do because we're hearing a number of folks feel that they're in imminent crisis, particularly when it comes to big dogs. And that staffing is playing a key role in that crisis, that the numbers of animals are similar or higher than 2019, but that the staff turnover has had a pretty massive impact. And we're seeing, I have Google alerts on shelter crisis topics, and we're just seeing such a huge number of communities waving the flag saying SOS. So curious about what's happening because we're going to be talking about it more on a future call. But what we're going to try to do is speak to national media with a collective voice rather than as individual communities, which we hope will be more effective. So welcome to the Friday Animal Welfare Leadership Roundup call. We're going to get right to it today because we do have a couple of topics that might be a little bit more intensive, particularly the second one. So what we're going to do is have our first topic, and I'll let Jamie Case introduce that. And that person's going to speak for just a brief amount of time. And then we're going to move to our second topic. And the second topic, as you probably know, is about the new study that came out around dog breed and genetics. So it's a lot of information today. And so if we do have extra time at the end, we will get to updates. And if any national orgs do have updates, if you could put those in the chat for now so that we get plenty of time with both of our speakers. So Jamie, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. So I'm excited today to have Beth Steinhorn here. I reached out to Points of Light about the importance of volunteers and how I think us as an industry could be better at utilizing volunteers fully. In my previous role as the director of an organization in Illinois, we went through the service enterprise training with Best Friends and Points of Light, and it was pretty groundbreaking for us. It really showed us the value, the importance, and really just helped us kind of button up all of our volunteer practices. So I reached out to Beth because I thought that information should be shared more widely. And Points of Light does have hubs all over the country where shelters and organizations can utilize that information and those trainings for you locally. So Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you so that you can talk more about the service enterprise process and the certification and why it's important.
Thanks, Jamie. Hello, everyone. It's great to be joining you today and to see a few familiar names actually as I scroll through the list. So I'm pleased to be here tuning in today from my office in Denver, Colorado, to where we're expecting snow later today. Happy spring to everyone. And to share with you a little bit about the Service Enterprise Initiative, as Jamie mentioned. I am a consultant. I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. I partner with Points of Light on delivering service enterprise training and certification, and have also helped to refine the curriculum et cetera, on a national level, and partnered with Best Friends as well to deliver it. I work exclusively with organizations on volunteer engagement strategy and have had the honor and privilege to work with many, many different organizations who work with animals in different ways. So pleased to be connecting with all of you, some new and some from the past. My slides will be available. I've shared the PDF. So if you have, I'm going to go through a lot of information fairly quickly, just to give a brushstroke introduction to service enterprise. So you understand what it, at least get a sense of what it is, what the benefits are, what the expectations and commitment would be to undertake this initiative, and then if you're interested in learning more and talking through any of the details, I can either connect you to a local hub to do that or follow up with you individually. So let me just pause for a moment before I get on my mile-a-minute talk here and just define what a service enterprise is. A service enterprise is an organization that fundamentally leverages volunteers and their skills to achieve its social mission. It's not an organization that happens to engage volunteers. It's an organization that puts volunteer engagement as core to its mission. So I'm very visual. I like to think of it as an organization that has an org chart where volunteers are not just up at the board level and in some direct service, but are also helping not just walk dogs or help shy kittens, but are also helping with marketing, with fund development, with advocacy, all levels, all branches of the org chart. As Jamie mentioned, Service Enterprise is a certification. It's a national designation that is increasingly recognized. And in order to achieve the Service Enterprise certification, that status, like that good housekeeping, seal of approval, but for volunteer engagement, the organization needs to go through a series of assessment, training, commitment, change management, and then ultimately apply for certification. As Jamie mentioned, it is delivered in many regions of the country locally through hubs, volunteer centers, or United Ways, or some other foundations, but there's a lot of the country that isn't reached by that network of hubs, in which case I am the hub for the areas without local hubs. And so, which is why I'm happy to be on the call today. So what is the goal of becoming a service enterprise? It's to strengthen the capacity of your organization to strategically and effectively engage volunteers to achieve your mission, to address community needs. This all began back in 2008-9 when a group of like-minded cross-sector leaders from nonprofits, government, philanthropy, research, corporate engagement, faith-based organizations got together with a shared belief that organizations that engage volunteers are better positioned to achieve their mission. And that coalition was called Reimagining Service. And they launched some research that at the time, this is from back in 2009, demonstrated that only 17% of nonprofits in the US at that point really had a strong volunteer engagement model. When they looked at all the different practices that were considered best practices, leading practices in volunteer engagement, only 11% embraced all of them. That in and of itself was a bit of a call to action to say, we could really be doing things better, but it wasn't enough without asking, is there a benefit? Is there something different about these 11% that do it well, these positive deviants, statistically speaking, these ones that, these outliers, is there a benefit that sets them apart that correlates with those practices? And in fact, they did find that looking back at the data and slicing and dicing it differently, they were able to see that when an organization embraces all best practices in volunteer engagement, all of their capacities, financial, technological, leadership, they're all significantly and markedly stronger. When they engage and manage any number of volunteers and do it well, they're better led and managed. And most significantly, which we thought was really relevant back in 2009, but boy, is it relevant now in 2022, organizations that operate as these service enterprises not only lead and manage better, but they're significantly more adaptable, sustainable, and capable of going to scale. And we certainly have seen that in recent years. These organizations that have, amidst all of the disruptions of the last couple of years, have not hibernated their volunteers, but instead put volunteers at the core of their sustaining efforts and adaptations, really have been able to not only sustain mission, but in some ways even deliver more. So those were just some of the components of the research that drove the initiative. The research also identified 10 characteristics that are associated with operating as a service enterprise. And in doing so, we're able to put together a curriculum. Even as early as 2016, organizations that became certified as service enterprises had more time, 2,700 more hours of donated time, which obviously has a financial value. But to me, it's not about more for the sake of more. It's about increasing efficiencies and stewarding resources. So some of you may know Tasia Blue Rescue. We worked with them to train and certify them. And I love Jackie's, then the executive director, her quote that we've been able to increase the number of dogs we're saving from area shelters by 78%. 78, that's not a typo, 78%, because we're more effectively engaging volunteers and being efficient with our resources. They had not increased the number of foster volunteers, but instead, by instituting these different more efficient processes, they reduced the time that the dogs remain in their care. And all that was through defining volunteer roles and efficient processes. And I see a couple other, Carly Fawn is on here too. Yep, great process. So thanks for the sharing your experiences in the chat. So the training is predominantly a change management training. This is not a volunteer management 101 for your volunteer coordinator, paid or unpaid volunteer coordinator. This is a team process that really looks at establishing a vision for your service enterprise transformation, a vision for volunteer engagement, understanding the processes and strategically looking at where volunteers could help enhance processes, and then developing and implementing a plan to make progress towards that vision. So exercises include things like gap analyses, where you map your as-is state, identify what needs to change, and determine if volunteers can play a role in that. We saw that this was from one of the shelters, I believe from Florida, that took place. They looked at their volunteer onboarding process. And in the end, it kind of ended with, well, and then the volunteers are left out there to sink or swim. And instead, they looked at what were the gaps. There was no formal application or interview process. There wasn't a consistent schedule, et cetera. And they were able to restructure it with new roles. Again, you'll have this in the slides if you want to look at it in more detail. And they found that in doing so, they were really able to increase retention, and more importantly, save staff time and increase their capacity to get more animals adopted out. I want to say that service enterprise is not just about your volunteer processes. It's not just about volunteer applications. Other organizations looked at their fund development processes and figured out where volunteers could be plugged in for that as well. So what does participation in the Service Enterprise Initiative look like? If you are intrigued enough, I'll give you a quick overview. It begins with an orientation for the team. Again, this is not just a one-person training for your volunteer coordinator. It is a requirement to have a team. When I'm involved, I usually encourage that team to include volunteers as well. And so the team takes it can be all virtual, an orientation. Then they and others at the organization, a select number, take a research-driven service enterprise diagnostic known as the SED. What every good initiative needs a good acronym, so we call this the SED, which has actually just been updated. We're about to launch SED 3.0, so it's been an iterative process, and the research keeps, the results keep driving a refinement of the initiative. Then there's a SED debrief meeting with your trainer, and then often in a cohort, all the teams from different organizations participate in 7 two-hour virtual trainings that are highly interactive and do have homework in between. Each team also gets coaching to implement the action plan that's developed throughout the training, and then finally they get to apply through a portfolio process for service enterprise certification, which involves a virtual site visit. The expectations, as you can see, are frankly not small. It's a commitment of not just filling out the application, but establishing a team, having the team participate in the orientation, completing the diagnostic, et cetera, really participating in this and doing the work in between, plus committing to continuous improvement. I never recommend an organization for certification if they've checked everything on their action plan off. There needs to be a plan for future ongoing work moving forward. There are lots of benefits to it, and just briefly, as you heard from Jamie and from a few others in the chat, it can be a real transformational process of establishing a vision, gaining a broader understanding of how volunteers can serve and what it takes to do that well, and really position you for the future. There is a cost involved, and to be perfectly honest, local hubs, there is no standard fee. One of the things Jamie and I talked about, there's no standard fee across different hubs. If we were to find that there was enough interest through this network to put together a cohort of 3, 5, 7, 10 organizations to do this work in 2023, then we could create through us a virtual hub across the country and implement it that way. If you're interested in finding out if there's a hub near you with whom you could work independently and not be in an all animal focused cohort, then we can also provide you with some follow-up information on that. Obviously, in terms of cost, it depends on the number. If the more in the cohort, the more the cost gets spread across and shared by everyone. So we've just put together, again, in speaking with Jamie, we put together a potential timeline just to give you a sense of what it could look like if we found that there were enough folks interested for 2023. Want to be really clear, it's and I think that this should say 2024 at the bottom. I'm so sorry. But sorry about that. This is looking at starting in January, February of 2023, and then getting certified in 2024. It's not a 3-month process. This is a 12 to 18-month commitment, and technically you have 24 months from orientation to certification. So, so sorry about the typo on that. I think I was still stuck in last year. But in any case, it's been a lot of, there have been many of your colleagues, some on this call, who've gone through the process, and I certainly encourage you to explore it. And I'm available, Kristen, if there's time for a question or two, or otherwise we can just share the slides and get you on to the next topic.
There probably isn't, and if you want to unshare your screen, we can just talk for a minute. What we are finding in shelters is that volunteer programs are the most underutilized resource. Shelter after shelter has, when you ask them how many full-time volunteers they have, 6 hours a month, shelters are telling us 5, 10, 20 instead of 500 or 1,000. And right now, with resources being what they are, it's essential that volunteer programs grow again, and they've been heavily impacted by COVID and suspension of programs. So we really appreciate you being here, and thank you so much for sharing this. We have to do something different to grow program. So I hope folks can get in touch with you after this.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Have a great morning, everyone.
Okay. So we have a really exciting speaker here. And has anyone, first of all, did anybody see the stuff about breed and coming out that there were all these popular articles coming out about breed and pit bull, and did anybody notice that in the media? And what did you notice about it? If you were like me, you probably noticed that you were like, yeah, we already talked about this. Like, yeah, we all know breed, genetics. So I thought that was true, and I was sort of out of the office and didn't pay tons of attention to it. But then I noticed that this is actually a completely different study, and I was able to talk to Janice Bradley about it. And she said, she was like, this is the most important research to date. It is the most game-changing study that has come out. It took something like 7 years. And so we have Jessica Heckman here, who's one of the researchers who did this project. And she's a big score for us here on this call, because this is potentially the most groundbreaking research that's ever been done. And what Janice couldn't be here today, but what she asked me to convey is that her take after reading it is that there is no longer any justification at all to breed label dogs in shelters. And that in fact, and so I don't know if our speaker agrees, but we're going to hear from her and a lot more. She's only going to talk for about 20 minutes because we want to leave time for questions, and because there will be a lot of questions. And so please feel free to either put your questions in the chat or just hold them until the end, and then we'll move right into questions. So Dr. Heckman, you are here with us, and I will let you take it from here.
Excellent. Can you hear me, first of all? Great. And then going to share my screen. Nope. Yes. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. We are good to go. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you all. Yeah, there's been a lot of different interpretations of this paper, so I'm here to give you my interpretation and to answer, hopefully, any questions that you have. Oh, no, that is, hang on, let me see if I can make this be better. View, I think I did full screen, but we want slideshow. Let's try that. Yes, much better. So a quick overview, just who I am. I am a veterinarian. After I graduated veterinary school, I did a shelter medicine internship at University of Florida, and that was fabulous. And I see Dr. Levy here, so hello to her. After that, I went on to a PhD program in behavioral genetics. And since then, I have worked as a behavioral geneticist, worked at teaching sort of the biology of behavior. And the group that I'm with now is the Functional Dog Collaborative. And I will talk like one sentence about them at the end. The reason I got invited here today is that I am the second author on what we fondly call the Mup paper, which indeed that whole project has been underway for 7 years. And I wanted to orient you all to sort of where I'm coming from. So I am second author on the paper, which means that I did a fair amount of work on the paper, but the person who has the most power over sort of how the paper is presented, how the paper was designed, is Eleanor Carlson, who is the last author on the paper. And then the first author, Kathleen Morrill, is a very, very bright graduate student. And she is often the one, she is the one who has all of the different analyses really loaded into her brain. And she is a good person to go to for specifics on some of the work that I didn't do. But I can certainly answer very specific questions on the work that I did, and I can answer more general questions on the work that Kathleen and others did. This group was a conglomeration of, so the two laboratories, both under Eleanor Carlson's aegis, are at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, and then also at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. We collaborated with IAABC, who you may all know as a group of behavior consultants. And then the project itself was named Darwin's Ark, and you can go to darwinsark.org to see more about it. So the way the study worked, and I am going very quickly because I'm trying to leave time for questions at the end. So if I skim over something you're curious about, certainly feel free to ask questions. The way the study worked is that we collected a very large sample size through owner-based surveys. So I think more than 16,000 dogs ended up being used in the study, which is compared to other behavioral genetics studies, a very, very large sample size. People have pointed out that there's the issue certainly of that we were getting information directly from owners. And I'm happy to talk more about whether owners are the right way to get information about animal behavior, but it is a well-accepted approach in behavioral genetics that an owner is going to understand the sort of overall long-term personality of their dog a lot better than the other alternative, which would be something like a trained professional coming in on one day and doing a behavior assessment. And there's a lot of problems with taking a snapshot of behavior on one day and hoping that it will affect personality. Certainly a possible bias here is that we have owners who are interested in filling out surveys online, and that certainly misses the sort of owner who is not as passionate about dogs and not interested in going online and filling out a lot of behavior questions. And then we collected DNA samples and sequenced more than 2,000 dogs. The other part of the data collection was the Mup Mix Project, which is still up in archive form if you want to go look at it at muttmix.org. This was a project where we had 32 very mixed breed mutts, and we showed people pictures of them, video of them, and sort of a brief clip of information from their owners about them. And then we asked people to try to guess what the top 3 breeds in each of those dogs were, and then we analyzed people's guesses. The way we worked with the behavior data, because there were so many questions, the sort of widely accepted way of collapsing all of that information of more than 100 questions about behavior is to do what's called a factor analysis, where you ask a computer program basically to take all of those questions and group them together. And then we look at the groupings, and the humans then had to try to say, based on this grouping, what is this about? So in this figure from the paper, section A on the left, you can see one of the groupings of the 8 factors was human sociability. So basically the computer handed us 17 questions. We read through those 17 questions and we said, these seem to be about this thing that seems to be about interacting with humans, enjoying interacting with humans, and we named that human sociability. So there have been a lot of questions when statements have been made about how heritable human sociability is versus biddability, and what does that really mean? The answer is what it means is the questions in the survey, and I will give you some information at the end of this talk about how to go find those exact questions, so that if you want to know what the questions are, you could certainly go look them up for yourself. So this is the best figure from the paper for looking at some of the results, looking at, first of all, does genetics matter in terms of these different factors? And for human sociability, genetics seem to matter a lot. Toy-directed motor patterns, which is code for retrieving, also seem to matter a lot. Biddability, how easily the dog responds to human direction, also seem to matter a fair amount. Of interest to many of you, probably agonistic threshold, which we were trying not to say the word aggression, did not seem to be highly heritable. We had our control at the bottom of size, how tall the dog is, which we knew was going to be highly heritable. And separate from does genetics matter, we looked at does breed matter, and you can see there's a much smaller effect of breed here, but there is an effect, there is some effect. And so some people are interpreting the paper to say that does breed matter, or does breed not matter? What this figure shows is how much of an effect there is, and you can sort of make your own conclusions about what that means in terms of the non-scientific term matter. Here's an example of what we found in terms of biddability, which was one of the most differentiated by breed factors that we looked at. And so I'm showing you with my pointer here, part C. So on this side of the graph are breeds that are more biddable. On this side of the graph are breeds that seem to be less biddable. You can see these lines here in the middle. That's the median, but then you can see that there's a lot of overlap in terms of the data, right? So there's a clear difference of the median, but there's a lot of overlap. And so that's one of the things that I think isn't going to surprise any of you, but was a strong message from the paper, that even when you see some differences between breeds or breed types, there's still a lot of overlap, and you are not going to expect to be able to completely predict a dog's behavior based on its breed. So some quotes from the paper that people found fairly powerful. Breed offers little predictive value for individuals, explaining just 9% of variation in behavior. To unpack that a bit, that 9% comes from looking at a variety of traits. Some of them had breed explained no variation, so there was 0%. Some of them breed explained up to 25%. Honestly, 9% for me as a behavioral geneticist is nothing to sneeze at. That's actually, to me, a fairly large amount. To the average human who hasn't done a lot of research in behavioral genetics, they might find that number more surprising. And, so when we're trying to explain to people about the importance of breed, that can be something to refer back to. And what that means, that breed explains 9% of variation behavior, that means that we built a statistical model, and we asked the model how much of all of the variation in behavior is explained by this one variable that we're handing you, that is breed. And then everything else, we would assume would be sort of all the other factors that go into things. I will mention again here, agonistic threshold was the factor least explained by genetics or breed. What we did not ask, which I think would be really interesting for the breed-specific legislation question, we did not ask, given that a dog is X breed, how likely is the dog to have Y trait? So given that the dog is an American Pit Bull Terrier, how likely is the dog to have the trait of aggression to humans? That would have been an interesting question. That wasn't what the point of the paper was, so we didn't ask it in that direction. However, I can show you, we have made available at darwinsark.org/Muttmix this interactive dashboard for working with some of this data. And so you can see the 8 factors here. And what you can do is you can select the factor that you're interested in and then hit submit. And the dashboard will show you it will rank the different breeds that we have information about and show you how common this particular trait is in that breed. So I have that the dog communicates displeasure, which again would correspond with uses aggression to deal with their issues. And you can see how common it is and how very similar the numbers are across breed. That 43% of mutts would people score them as being willing to show their displeasure that way. And then you can sort of look through and see how it's pretty similar across breeds. And I cut this off because that went on farther. For those who are curious, American Pit Bulls are here, 45%. I also wanted to point out this particular phrasing for those of you who are looking for phrases from the paper to use in your job of explaining to people about breed and behavior. So one quote from the paper is, for more heritable, more breed differentiated traits like biddability, knowing the breed ancestry can make behavioral predictions somewhat more accurate. But for less heritable, less breed differentiated traits like agonistic threshold, breed is almost uninformative. And that, I think, could be a useful phrase for people who are interested in discussing breed specific legislation and whether it works or doesn't work. I wanted to point that out. Another quote, that behavioral factors show high variability within breeds, suggesting that although breed may affect the likelihood of a particular behavior to occur, breed alone is not informative about an individual's disposition. And that this really encapsulates my feeling about it, is that, if you're trying to recommend to someone what the best route is to get a good family pet, I would guide them more in the direction of a golden retriever than a Malinois as their first steps. But the next thing I would say is to, if you're getting the dog out of a shelter, to really assess the individual. If you're working with a breeder, to really talk to the breeder and meet the dog's parents. So it's not just about breed. You can't just get any golden retriever and assume that it's going to be a good pet. There's a lot more going into it, but going in this direction, sort of trying to pick the dog, breed can help you go in that direction, as opposed to having an individual in front of you and trying to assess them and using breed to do that. Going in that direction, it's not as useful. The Muttmix.org study found this is the first time that anyone had done deep sequencing of the American mutt, and we really looked at how many breeds were in there and found that in the case of a lot of mutts, they have a lot of breeds mixed together. We had some information about how people identify mutt ancestry, which I hope could be interesting and useful to some. So for example, for guessing that there's pity in a dog, people will tend to go for, does it have a short coat? And what is the ear shape? Some interesting stuff in here. Leg length will make you guess dachshund. Coat length will point you to chow chow. And I want to note that these are all, these morphological traits are not controlled by a large number of genes, and it's very easy for a dog to have a large number of different breeds in its ancestry to happen to show one particular trait from one or two genes having to do with coat length, ear shape, coat furnishings, meaning whether it has a beard or not. And people will grab onto those particular traits to make their visual identifications of mutt ancestry. And it may be a very, very small part of the dog's breed ancestry. I think you've probably all recognized that if you have a long-haired dog, people will almost never guess if that there would be any American Pit Bull Terrier in that at all, even though it just takes one gene. It would have to be homozygous, but you could have, two of the grandparents would have to be long-haired, and would be sort of all it takes. Okay. I also found this part of the paper very powerful. So the same amount of pity ancestry, in this case, we were using American Pit Bull Terrier breed specifically, can lead to very different phenotypes. So these dogs are all right around 25% ancestry of American Pit Bull Terrier detected by genetic sequencing. And then when we asked people to guess, so they're all about the same amount pity, we asked people to guess how much pit bull is actually in there. You can see that the guesses were widely varying. And you can see here again, for this dog, I imagine Jack number 2, people were probably mostly guessing some kind of collie or golden retriever ancestry based on coat length and coat color and ear shape. As we get up to Esme, that's the kind of dog that a whole lot of people would think that there's some pit bull ancestry in there, but she only has 2% more than Jack number 2. So about pretty much the same thing. So yeah, just moving through this quickly again, but again, there's just a very limited set of traits that people use to guess breed ancestry. And then just to briefly mention that for the behavioral geneticists, there were some very exciting findings in this paper associating regions of DNA with specific behaviors, which is going to hopefully lead to interesting research in the future and is really not all that relevant to the popular press and to the lay people who are talking a lot about this paper. But for me, this was the really exciting part of the paper. And so just that bit of irony. People like to push back on this paper by asking, were well-bred dogs used? implying that we would see more differences between breeds behaviorally if we had limited ourselves to working with breeders who were very carefully breeding dogs. And the answer is no, we threw out a wide net and we were trying to look at dogs of all sorts. And a breed can encompass a lot of different types. And so think about the difference between a show Labrador, a field Labrador, a guide dog Labrador. Those all have different behavior, and yet they are all Labradors. And so that is probably a part of the reason that we did not see a stronger signal of breed. Does this paper say genetics doesn't matter? No, genetics are a separate thing from breed. And so it still makes sense if someone is thinking about purchasing a puppy from a breeder, it definitely makes sense to talk to that breeder, make sure they know their lines, look at the parents of the potential puppy. Genetics definitely matters in that way. And no one is saying that the paper disagrees with that. And again, does the paper say breed doesn't matter? Matter or doesn't matter? There's not a statistical test for that, really. There's a lot of different analyses. And so I think everybody can come to their own conclusion, but it does show that going from the direction of taking breed and then saying, now I know what the individual's behavior is going to be, definitely the paper shows that that is a flawed approach. But I do think that breed does increase the likelihood of seeing certain traits. It just is not good at going the opposite direction of predicting traits in an individual. So for those of you, almost all of you coming from shelters, I would just wanted to summarize visual breed identification of mixed breed dogs, very unreliable. What you see is going to be very hard to translate into what's actually there. A purebred may have specific breed traits, but they may not. So you really should assess each dog as an individual. And for legislators, lawyers, or people working against BSL, my first 2 points are the same about visual breed identification, purebreds not being sort of behavioral clones of each other. I note that agonistic threshold is not strongly associated with any breed, and that mixed breeds are less likely than purebreds to have specific breed traits. So if you're looking at a mixed breed dog of a particular breed and trying to guess whether it has a low agonistic threshold based on that breed, that's not a great way to go about it. Assess each dog as an individual. I will make sure that this information gets out to you folks, but the places to get the data, all of the data downloadable at Data Dryad, and I provided the link here, but you can go to Data Dryad and search on the title of the paper. At the bottom of the paper, there's a link to supplemental information, which is a PDF that has a whole bunch more. It's another like 150, 200 pages worth of data. And you can also go download, basically this zip file is a spreadsheet, which has a whole lot more data in it. One of those two, I think it's the spreadsheet at the bottom here, will have all of those questions that went into the factors. I did want to mention the Functional Dog Collaborative, the nonprofit that I am the founder of, and we are hoping to sort of to raise the tide of how people are breeding dogs. There's a lot of not so good dog breeding out there, and I deeply believe that one of the reasons that dogs end up in shelters is because we're not giving them a good genetics or a good socialization start in life, and that one of the things that we should be looking at, in addition to all the other excellent work that you are all doing with transports and decreasing length of stay and increasing volunteer power. In addition to that, I think it's also important to look at where dogs are actually coming from initially and trying to help people do a better job of that so that dogs are getting their best beginnings and able to stay in their initial homes that they first land in. All right, so that said, if you're interested in other presentations from me, go to dogzombie.com to get on my mailing list. Check out the FDC at functionalbreeding.org, and I think we have plenty of time for questions, some time for questions. Okay, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that. We'll turn it over to questions now. And if you could please just keep your questions to a minute or less so we can get to as many as possible, that would be great. And we'll let you, let's see, I'm looking for questions in the chat, and it looks like we don't have too many in the chat. So let's just turn it over to you. Remember, just jump on in and ask your question. Don't wait, so we can avoid that awkward Zoom silence.
Oh, I should have talked more slowly. Will there be a book?
I thought Jessica had asked about, would there be something that's kind of more public facing, you know, like infographics or something that could be used to help with these discussions?
Yeah, so God, I get that question every single time. And I am currently writing a layperson's overview of the paper. So it's sort of going through what the different studies are. It's basically this talk, but encapsulated in text version so that it's easier to share. I finally found time to start working on that yesterday. I'm hopeful to be done with that in the next few days. And I will push that out on social media. And so I can, you know, I can try to get to let you folks know so that you have that to point to.
I just have one quick question that's burning, which is, will the Functional Dog Collaborative assist with sort of recommending ethical, responsible breeding of pit bull dogs? Chappies?
Yeah, so I mean, that sort of gets into the larger question of sort of how we do what we do. And that whole question of how you, so we certainly are not going to treat pit bulls in any different way than any other breed. Like, we're about trying to have people create dogs that fit into their goals, be that being a pet or a working dog. And obviously there are a lot of people in this country who really love pitties, love living with them, and love to have well-bred pitties who are starting out life with good socialization. So they absolutely would be included. And I can talk more if you want about the way we would do that for all dogs. But I think your question was mainly like, are we going to sort of be cutting pitties out? And definitely not.
Thank you. Peter, I saw you turn on your camera. Did you have a question?
I did. Actually, I have a question maybe of interest to nobody else on the call. The data visualizations in the paper are amazing. And so the questions come up, did you all do that? Did you have funding to do it? Or is that Science as a journal provided those for a paper of this kind?
We got so lucky. Yeah, that's a great question. We got so lucky. Kathleen Morrill, who was the first author on the paper, could have been, I think, a really good artist, professional artist. She is a really good artist. Could have been a really good professional artist. She did pretty much all the data viz. And it shows like all the little pictures where there's like the cute little cartoon of a dog to illustrate. She did all of that. She put it all together. So we just got very lucky there. She's fantastic.
I have a question in reference to, was there a question in the data that asked these owners before they did their, like, as they were going through and rating their pets and before they did the ancestry, was there a question of whether or not they had been through training and whether the behavioral training that they had made a difference? Because
right, that's also a great question. We did not try to control for training because training, that's a huge question, obviously, right? Like if you try to say, you know, did you train your dog or how much did you train your dog? That just opens up to all the question of how did you train your dog? You know, how well did your dog respond? Was it appropriate? The answer to trying to pick the signal out of the noise is the large sample size. Right. And so that was just the approach that we took rather than trying. I mean, the other way to do it would be a small sample size and really trying to dig into the individuals and understand them. But we knew, again, because we had this strong interest in the behavioral genetics part and that association of the DNA regions with the behavioral traits, we needed a really large sample size for that. So that was just the approach this particular study took.
So then secondary to that, you can tease out now and go back and say, okay, out of those that are thinking about going back to a shelter, what kind of training did they have? And or, you know, tease that out on the ancestry too. That would be an interesting secondary study.
Yeah, that would be a really interesting follow-up. for sure.
Thanks. Amazing work.
Yeah, thank you. And Julie Levy noticed that we got the cover story, and I think we all like to tell ourselves that we got the cover story because the paper was so cool, but I also suspect that it's because dogs are cute and Science was eager to put dogs on the cover. So there's that. Science did the cover themselves. We did not do that.
And puppies sell.
Jessica, what is your vision? Let's say 10 years, things kind of go your way. This research is sort of implemented into changing practices. What looks different for dogs?
So, oh gosh, well, I mean, I tried to point out, I think there's a lot of different ways of answering that question, and to try to focus on what's relevant to this particular group. I tried to say at the end of my very short and brief talk that I hope that we would look at dogs more as individuals. So when we're in the situation of being in a shelter setting and a dog comes in, hopefully we don't look at it and say it's short-haired and blocky-headed and therefore it must be a pit mix, and therefore we're going to, I sort of don't want to weigh in on the whole labels on kennels thing. And I think there's interesting research to be done there about what the effects of that are, but understanding that when a dog comes in and you look at it, particularly if it's a mixed breed dog, you have the dog's appearance is going to give you very little to go on in terms of what the dog's behavior is going to be, and that we really do need to work with that dog in order to understand it as an individual. Certainly in terms of breed specific legislation, I feel very strongly that breed specific legislation is not the appropriate way to reduce dog aggression in a community. And I'm really hopeful that this research will be helpful to groups that are fighting that, that communities will start to understand that breed is a small part. It's an influence in what makes a dog the way they are, but early environment, socialization, that is so important, and really focusing on, hopefully on positive ways of getting that to dogs. But focusing on, again, on are there individual dogs who are problems in the community rather than trying to make sort of blanket approaches.
Can I just ask, oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, it's okay. I just saw that there's a couple other questions in chat. So Erin, why don't you ask your question, and then we'll plan on me answering some of the chat questions, and then maybe there will be someone else afterwards.
It's actually, I just realized I interviewed you almost 10 years ago about this topic.
Was it 10 years ago?
10 years ago for a story in Huffington Post. I was just looking at it to make sure I had that right.
That's so funny, yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I understand sort of the TLDR of this. So what you're saying is breed has some influence on personality, but you won't know, looking at any individual dog sort of out of context, you won't know what influence that's going to have on the dog. You can only judge that dog sort of as an individual and try to get to know them as an individual. Is that basically right?
Yeah, it is. And I actually went through the paper prior to this just to make sure it was true, that we really didn't ask that question of, if all I know about a dog is its breed, then how powerful is my predictive power about any particular trait? And we didn't ask it in that direction. But I definitely think of this in terms, because I'm a veterinarian, in terms of doing a test. If I want to test a dog for aggression to humans or to other dogs, is asking what its breed is the best way to get a good answer to that test that I can really trust? And that definitely not. I definitely also want to say, though, that the other way around is that you can use breed as sort of a way to start your search and to say, if I'm looking for, and again, aggression we showed was not very differentiated across breeds at all. But in terms of human sociability, there was some differentiation. So if I want to look for a dog that's very sociable, that's very cuddly and wants to hang out with me, I can probably make my search shorter by selecting some specific breeds to start with. But again, breed should not be my only, and we all know, I shouldn't just say, I want a golden retriever, I'll go click on the internet and get a golden retriever and it will be exactly what I want, like I got something from McDonald's. We know that, but there's a lot of people, I think, out there in the rest of the world who don't know that. And it can surprise us in the dog community that there are people who don't really realize that a breed isn't like a brand or a make of car that you know exactly what you're going to get. And I think this paper can be useful to tell people that. Okay, so let's see. Dylan had a comment that the argument for breed typing in dogs in the shelter is to capture the way people shop for dogs. Yeah, sure. I mean, that's right. That's useful and definitely not something that we looked at. Here we go. This is what I saw from Augusta Farley. How could we use this information as well as specific observed behaviors on kennel cards in a shelter to help potential adopters understand the suitability of the pet in front of them? And I think if you know a dog's breed, it could be argued, and I will leave this to the shelter community, that if you know that it's a purebred, it could be useful to put the breed name on next to the kennel card and say, you know, here's some traits that are associated with the breed, with a note that this dog, in our observation, you know, seems to be similar to what we would expect from the breed in these ways, but perhaps not in these other ways. But remember that dogs are going to be different when they leave the shelter and go home. And so maybe the dog is very shut down and quiet here, but it's a German short-haired pointer. So we want to just counsel you to be aware that this dog may have high energy requirements. So that could be something that people could do. Then we have another question from Namiko Otanoveski. In humans, it is big 5 to describe personality. Are these 8 test categories essential for dogs to describe their personality? I would say no. These were what came out of our factor analysis. There's actually is some very interesting research in the literature. Why am I blanking on the name? Goodwin, of the researcher who did the work. Say it again.
Bronwyn Dickey?
No. Damn it. Sorry. It'll come to me. But I've met him in person too. But there's some really interesting research looking at personality traits in animals, and there's specifically a paper. I think if you search, actually, let me quickly see if I can find it. And dog personality on Google Scholar. So I'm not seeing the paper I'm looking for right off, but there is a paper looking at sort of comparing the big 5 to animals and to dogs specifically. And I think the overall consensus is that there's more like a big 4 in animals, and maybe conscientiousness is one that animals don't have as much as humans have. But there's a lot of literature about that. And so I would not take this as weighing in on that particular question. Let's see if there's any other.
Dr. Levy had a question.
Yes, I just found it. How can you study the influence of genetics on behavior without using guessed breed or appearance as the criteria? As you said, human personality has a high genetic influence, but breed is not a construct used in human behavior. Right. So we definitely had the concern that when we asked, I think this is what Julie's getting at. We had the concern when we asked owners to answer questions about the dog's breed that, for instance, if you ask, does your dog like to play fetch, that someone who had a Labrador Retriever might be more likely to answer sort of more strongly towards the yes side of that, based on the fact that they had a lab, because they sort of have this construct in their mind of labs like to fetch, and maybe my dog doesn't like to fetch so much, but I really, whenever they try to fetch even a little bit, I really perceive it because there is a lab. So that is definitely something that we were really interested in this paper. One of the ways that we tried to get at that was through the mutts. And so we had a bunch of mutts who had been genetically sequenced, so we knew what their breed ancestry was. And we looked at the heritability of the different traits in the mutts and compared that to the heritability of those same traits in the purebreds. And so we didn't find a very strong owner bias there. We did find that the traits that seemed to be strongly heritable in the purebreds also seemed to be strongly heritable in the mutts. And so I would encourage you to go take a look in the paper for that particular section. because that has, there's some interesting stuff there where we tried to piece that apart.
Dr. Heckman, we are out of time, so we're gonna end for now, but I'm hoping that you and perhaps Joyce and maybe others can come back and actually have a conversation about the Functional Dog Collaborative. I'm so curious and have so many more questions related to that. And I think
I would love that.
We've all been really thinking about the future of dog acquisition, and I think people have really strong feelings about it, but it being grounded in data seems really important. So I really appreciate that you are working from such a data-driven perspective, and I'm so grateful you're here today, and thanks to Joyce for bringing you to the call.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're not here next week. That is the Memorial Day weekend, and I feel like a lot of exhausted people are taking the day off. So we are not going to have a call next week. We'll have one the following, and I'm here all summer. My vacation's over, so we'll be here all summer having some really fascinating topics. There's so much cool research coming out right now. And I will be reaching out to you. I got a number of emails from some of you about this media work we're doing to have a united voice. So I'll be reaching out to you all who emailed me. Reach out anytime. We are working on the shelter crisis stuff actively. So if you feel like you're drowning, don't wait, just drop me an email and we'll be in touch. Thanks everybody, and have a great weekend. We will see you back here in 2 weeks.